My name is Emily O'Leary. I'm with Beaver County Boots for Change, and this is our very first of a series of events that we're calling our Library Speaker Series. And we want to reach out to the community and address issues that touch all of our lives. And so we thought, living in Beaver, this would be an excellent way to start. I'm going to introduce Mr. Matt Mihalik. He is going to be presenting this evening. He is the director of the Project Breathe Collaborative, and the communication platform of it is the Project Breathe in Pittsburgh. He has created Pittsburgh's Sustainable Business Network, and it's called Champions of Sustainability. Since 2008, he teaches sustainability and environmental policy at the Hines College at CMU. And he has a PhD in systems engineering from the University of Virginia. And without further ado, I'm going to turn over him to you. You're not here to hear me, you're here to hear him. And thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you, Emily, for organizing this. And this is a tremendous response. And it's so encouraging to see so many people who are interested in this issue. I'd like to think you all came out to see me, but I know you're here because of the issue. So I'm going to do the best I can to elevate a few things so that all of you walk away with some key takeaways so that you can have informed dialogue in your community about petrochemical development here in Beaver County and southwestern Pennsylvania. So as Emily said, I'm the director of the Breathe Project. Our mission is to improve air quality in southwestern Pennsylvania because it's still a problem. Before we get into all of that, I just want to give a little bit more about my background about how I got involved in this issue. I didn't seek out to become an environmental advocate and organizer like I am now with the Breathe Project. I actually started off as an engineer, and I got interested in how systems change through innovation. And I worked on, through my graduate work, this project on a whim to talk to the dean of the architecture school at the University of Virginia about a new project where he was trying to design products that go into buildings so that they're non-toxic and don't harm people. And I got interested in it just because the environment was used as an innovation driver. But even more important was that this industry, this textile industry in the Rhine Valley in Switzerland, which had been there for 400 years, was disappearing. It was going away, just like my experience of growing up in the Mon Valley in Pittsburgh. And so, to me, it was very interesting to see how the environment was being used as a driver of innovation to save enterprise and create economic prosperity. And so that's what my research work has been on for a number of years, and that's how I eventually got involved with doing all of this. And in fact, I came back to Pittsburgh to bring this idea and get people organized around it. So I worked with the corporate community for 9 years and built performance programs based off of the environment as a driver of innovation. And from there were many tremendous achievements of multiple businesses around the Pittsburgh area. One of these things was called the Green Workplace Challenge, and we had all of these regional organizations engaged in a competition to save energy, to save water, and to reduce environmental footprint. And I was involved with launching this from 2011 through 2016, several iterations of it. And then we were able to do almost 6,000 specific measurable actions that resulted in things like reducing landfill waste by 35%, and reduction in tonnage of 24%, and increasing the diversion rate for recycling by 20%. We saved this amount of electricity, almost 112,000 kilowatt hours of electricity. That's enough to power 10% of the city homes in the city of Pittsburgh for an entire year. And that saved all of those entities about $9 million in costs. And if you factor out the greenhouse gas reductions, 25,000 metric tons, that's about 5 days of the airport's emissions taken away. It didn't cost anybody anything to do this. And in fact, it paid them back. And all of these jobs at these corporations, they became green jobs. They're regular jobs, but people using the environment as a driver turn them into green jobs. We saved enough water to fill Heinz Field 93 feet deep. Okay? This is the air quality improvements of nitrogen oxide, 10 school buses worth, 1.5 Boeing 777's weight worth of sulfur dioxide, almost a whole Steeler line of nitrogen dioxide, and enough mercury kept out, 5 pounds, to meet the OSHA standard. You'd have to distribute it in a Goodyear blimp's worth of air. These are all positive things. Particulate matter reduced 6,500 pounds, and we gave out awards. And, so for example, medium businesses, these were businesses that were involved, large businesses, all these folks were doing very positive things. So that's and then what happened was I got involved in air quality work in the businesses trying to get them to tackle our region's biggest problem, which is air quality, and they won't do it. So that's why I got involved with the Breathe Project. It's a massive organizing effort to mobilize multiple, right now it's 35 different groups, some community groups like BCMAC, some universities like the University of Pittsburgh School of Public Health, air monitoring experts at Carnegie Mellon, and an array of advocacy groups, and we're all working together to improve air quality. And so this is the thing. We still have a serious air quality problem, and here's the key to tonight. Adding to it is only going to make things worse. So I want to talk about our baseline before we start jumping ahead. So let's talk about Beaver County. Right now, the American Lung Association gives Beaver County an F for ozone emissions, a B for 24-hour particles, and annual particle pollution, it's given a grade of barely passing, okay? This F, though, is a problem because volatile organic compounds and nitrogen oxide emissions, if we add more of them, it's going to make this grade even worse. You can't really go below F, but it's like really bad F. Compare that with Allegheny County. We get straight Fs. So your air generally blows to Allegheny County, where we add even more pollution to it. So in the population center, we have even bigger problems than here. If you take the greater Pittsburgh region and look at the air quality index, 2/3 of the time our air is rated not good. Okay? That includes Beaver County, that includes Allegheny County, and the surrounding metropolitan regions. If you look at how many days are green for all of the Pittsburgh area in 2008, so there was some improvement. The improvement is because we had the wettest year on record last year. A lot of rain, it washes out some of the pollution, so that's why we saw an improvement. But still a substantial number of yellow, red, and orange days. And then if you compare the Pittsburgh region with other metropolitan regions on a scale of 0 to 100 based off of monitoring data, we come in at the 8.5 percentile, where lower is bad, higher is good. And to give you a point of reference, New York City is at about the 50th percentile. So no one wakes up in the morning in New York and says, smell that clean New York air, right? But that shows you how big of a challenge that we have here in southwestern Pennsylvania in the Pittsburgh region. And our biggest problem are particles. Particles get deep into the lungs. They're small enough that your body can't defend against it, and it gets in the bloodstream, and it's why we have high cancer rates. So if you look at Beaver County has an elevated cancer risk compared with the national average. The blue is the national average. The green is the Beaver County area. So there's an elevated respiratory cancer risk and an overall cancer risk elevated versus the national level. And the cancer risk in Beaver County is 30 cases of a million people is the current rate. And that's elevated above national average. Allegheny County is much worse. We're in the worst 2% of counties where a lot of the county has over 100 cases in a million, and it's a problem. And then people will say, well, maybe it's just the Mon Valley where the air pollution is. It's not just one monitor. It's widespread. 3 of our sites are in the worst 10%, the next 4 in the worst 20th percentile, and then our best site was the 60th percentile, which is in northern Allegheny County. So most of our air is a problem in our region. In the same way with ozone. We've got several sites, Beaver County and North Fayette monitor worst 30%, and then the rest are in the lower half of national standards. This is a chart that shows that most of our air pollution comes from industry. 58% of it comes from industry. That's different than places like California, where most of the air, the polluted air, comes from mobile sources. And so that's what makes us unique. Okay, so that's the baseline. That's where we're already started, and what our main Breathe Project mission is to try to move the needle on that. So along comes the petrochemical industry in the last 10 years, knocking on the door saying, you've got all of this gas underground, we want to do something with it. Okay? We've been working on campaigns to educate people about what we have learned about the effect of the petro industry when they come knocking on the community door. And we've done a lot of work with BCMAC and others over the past few years. So I've got 10 quick takeaways for you all tonight. So number one is the footprint of the petro industry is already huge and getting bigger. It seems like a fairly straightforward thing, but just to put some numbers on it and a fine point on it. So as of April of this year, there were over 12,000 wells in the state drilled and over 13,000 violations at those drilling sites. So if you get a well, you're going to get a problem, is what that says. And this is a map that shows the yellow dots are where the problems are, and the purple dots are other wells. And so you can see it's pretty evenly distributed. Beaver County over here, Washington County, this whole area has as many problems as wells. So that's one thing that people need to keep in mind. And the drilling and the wells also snake along the Ohio River and include sites in Ohio and West Virginia as well. So this is already a massive scale impact in the region. And that's one thing that people need to recognize. We have the Shell cracker plant being built here, but it's part of a larger system that includes all these sites that are distributed throughout the landscape of the region. Okay, here's takeaway number two. The industry uses a piecemeal approach. That makes it hard for communities. What does that mean? They'll come into a community and say, we just have one little project that we want to do. And the regulations will be set up to regulate for that one little project. And they'll get the approval for that. And then they'll come back and say, well, it's actually that project and a little bit more. And it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. In the case of Beaver County, for the Shell cracker plant, you had 3 commissioners in Potter Township making decisions about an investment at a scale that will impact millions of people in the region. And it's because, again, the cookie cutter approach of, well, it's just this one facility and we'll pick a township where we can have high influence and make sure that we get to have our way. So, this includes drilling sites, this includes the pumping of water, impoundments for frack water, for supplying to the wells, and for when there's flowback water. It includes compressor stations where a compressor station doesn't rise to the level of requiring a Title V permit review. It's not considered a major emission source, but it does have substantial emissions, and if you put a bunch of these compressors in a region, it can have a big impact. But the regulatory framework can't handle that right now. So that's why this is tough for communities to fight. This is a cryogenic fractionation facility where they separate the gas that comes out from underground. Some of it is methane, which is dry gas. Some of it is wet gas, like ethane or propane, and those are used for other products like making of plastic, and we have more to talk about that in a few minutes. So you all will recognize this. This is the former Horsehead Zinc site that is now where the Shell cracker plant is being built. It gives you an idea of the scale of what's being involved here. They moved a highway. They got state funding to move the highway. And this was covered with a lot of dirt. You can see from the opposite bank where a lot of the dirt came from for capping off the site that's here. Again, 3 borough commissioners making decisions about something that is that massive scale. And then here is the other piece. So right now at Congress, they're debating upon whether to provide billions of dollars in subsidies to support underground storage of the product that comes out from underground. So here's the Ohio River, and these red areas are places where they are looking to do underground storage, called a natural gas storage hub. And the reason for that is when you frack wells, you get huge amounts of product. And the laws of supply and demand work such that if you have a glut of supply, the price plummets. So what industry wants to do is frack it, bring it up, and put it right back down underground again in another place where they can pump it out when they need it. And they want us to subsidize that. So this just shows you all the different scale elements. Piecemeal, any one piece looks like it's manageable. But when you put it all together, you're talking about something that is of massive scale, and that's a challenge to all of us. Okay, number 3, pollution impacts are and will be substantial. So here is a map from Frac Tracker. It's hard to see the boundary between Ohio and Pennsylvania, but it's basically where the red dots stop and the blue dots start. And each dot is a fracking well, and there are millions of gallons of contaminated water that come up from a fracking site. And right now, it's all being shipped to Ohio. So these blue dots are Class 2 disposal wells. The larger dots accepting somewhere between 4.1 and 11 million barrels of highly contaminated frack water. And so the trucks are taking this water and sending it across the border into Ohio, where they're dumping it underground. The problem is that they're running out of these disposal wells in Ohio. And so now they're trying to figure out what to do with this fracking waste. And no one really has a good answer for that. But some proposals are to do things like spread it on the roads in the wintertime to melt snow, which, by the way, is something that just passed the state legislature recently. Also, they're looking for ways to put it in wastewater treatment plants. So all of this are the impacts, pollution impacts that you may or may not be aware of, but these are things for us to be concerned about. This is a little story about Belle Vernon's sewage plant. This is a sewage plant that is adjacent to a landfill. And the landfill, throughout its history, because when it rains, there's a certain amount of leachate that would go to the wastewater treatment plant, and they would treat it, and it would go in the Mon River. Well, the landfill started accepting drill cuttings from fracking sites. And those drill cuttings were being dumped there. And the sewage treatment plant, all of their bugs that they used to treat the water were dying. And they thought they were doing something that was wrong. And at the end, they figured out it was because of the highly contaminated leachate that was coming from the adjacent landfill. So they asked them to stop sending it over, and the landfill said no. So what they did was they called the DEP, and they said, DEP, the permit for leachate from this site is only so much. Please tell them to stop sending it over. And the DEP said, just pay the fine and keep taking the water. So the supervisors in Belle Vernon took this to court. And eventually, this was just in August of this year, they got an order to stop that waste from going to that landfill and that leachate coming over and ending up in the Mon River upstream for where millions of people get their drinking water. Okay. These are the air emissions that are approved for the Shell Petro facility. Okay, 348 tons of NOx, 1,000 tons of carbon monoxide, then large amounts of particulate matter, 159 tons of particulate matter per year, and then VOCs, 522 tons of VOCs that contribute to the formation of ozone, as well as NOx contributing to ozone as well too. And then 2.2 million tons of CO2 per year. I have some more statistics coming up to talk about the impact of just the 159 tons of PM in proximity to the plant. Let's just talk about that 2.2 million tons of CO2. So this is a disaster from a climate perspective. this amount of CO2 emissions. Just to give you an idea of what 2.2 million tons of CO2 is equivalent of, it's equivalent to an old coal-fired power plant in Allegheny County, the Cheswick Power Plant. It's the number 2 source of carbon emissions in Allegheny County, the Edgar Thomson Works being the biggest. But that's what's being added, you know, just across the river from here, that amount of CO2 per year. It's enough for the equivalent of, 432,000 automobiles per year emissions. So Allegheny County has a little over 900,000 cars registered. So it's like adding half of the number of cars in Allegheny County's carbon emissions. But that's happening out here in Beaver County. I don't know how many cars are registered here in Beaver County, but it's certainly, you know, this is probably 4 or 5 times the amount of cars registered in Beaver County, the amount of impact. Okay, so part of this issue is, this shows from a climate perspective, Pennsylvania's carbon footprint. And it's been going down from 2005 to 2015 as we closed old coal-fired power plants. These were closing because they were inefficient. Okay, they needed to be replaced. They weren't going to continue living on and working because they were uneconomical. And so what our state did was, first of all, we have renewable portfolio standards, which increase the amount of renewable energy efficiency standards, and demand response programs, all of which promotes energy efficiency, which is the very first thing that any state needs to be doing for meeting its electrical needs. Work with what you have, but be more efficient with it. But then we started building natural gas-fired power plants. Okay? And at first, that's a good thing, at least in the short term, but the methane emissions are questionable from a long-term perspective, from a climate perspective. And so this is the forecasted trajectory of our greenhouse gas emissions through the year 2050. And the yellow line is what we need to get to in order to meet the climate accord agreements. So we are locking into place an infrastructure with natural gas-fired power plants that will guarantee that our carbon emissions will go up over time in the year 2025, 2035, and so on. It's exactly the wrong time for that to happen. That is when the window to actually stop runaway climate change, that window is going to close. So we got to start doing some things before that in order for our children to have a viable future like the way that we have experienced it when we were growing up. Okay, number 5, healthcare impacts. Significant negative healthcare impacts from the development of this industry. So we modeled the particle emissions from the build-out of 3 cracker plants. One here in Beaver, another one in West Virginia, and then a third one in Shadyside, Ohio. And they're modeled at this scale of emissions based off of the emissions of the Shell cracker plant, okay, scaled appropriately. And we modeled using EPA software called COBRA. And remember, this is only particle emissions. This is not hazardous air pollutants and ozone and others. This is only particles. And this is the yearly increased cost in healthcare in these different places, yearly. So in Beaver County, the expectation is when that plant is up and running, actually all 3 plants, you will be paying about $50 million a year more in healthcare costs in Beaver County due to increased cancer rates, due to increased respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, COPD, asthma, and so forth. That's what is expected. Allegheny County, between $15 and $32 million. It's higher here because you're closer to where the emissions are, right? Even though there's more population in Allegheny County. You can also see in Belmont, Ohio, it's significant. And also in West Virginia and so on, nearby. And if you add that up over 30 years, that's pretty significant healthcare costs. Nationally, between $3.5 and $8 billion in costs. And remember, this is just the particle emissions. This is not from hazardous air pollutants or VOCs or nitrogen oxide or ozone, because we don't have a model to incorporate those things. So this is kind of the best that we can do as a baseline. And then it's not lost on us that Allegheny Health Network is building a cancer institute directly above the cracker plant at the Beaver County Mall, right? There's a certain degree of sick irony about that. This is a series from the Post-Gazette in Washington County showing clusters of rare cancers, Ewing sarcoma, and cases that are showing up in proximity to where there are lots of wells. This is still an ongoing major debate with the state public health agency about whether or not to actually call this a cancer cluster or not. When the state initially did the assessment, they didn't include all the data points. They picked dates that excluded cases that they already knew about, and they drew geographic boundaries so that when they sent out the report, they said at the 95th confidence interval, we don't think there's a cancer cluster that's here. But they won't tell us what confidence interval shows that it is a cancer cluster. Maybe it's the 90th confidence interval, right? So we're trying to get that information and to get them to redo that assessment. These are rare bone cancers that happen rarely at all throughout the United States, and they're showing up in large numbers where there's a lot of these wells. Okay, let's talk finance for a couple minutes. Pennsylvania residents are paying and will pay a heavy financial price for aligning with petrochemicals. Number one, we gave Shell $1.65 billion in tax forgiveness. Right? It's the largest tax break in state history. In exchange, the company must invest $1 billion and create at least 2,500 construction jobs. Those are the only strings attached. Notice that it doesn't say Pennsylvania workers here. So you all probably notice license plates from other parts of the country where there is a lot of drilling in your community. Importing of workers. Shell was saying that they couldn't find qualified workers here in Pennsylvania, but that's not true. Everyone here can do, there are plenty of skilled workers here to do that. Then there was also a $10 million grant for site development and infrastructure costs. This talks about property values and whether or not you live in proximity to a well or not. And if you have well water and you're within about a mile of a well, your property value goes down on average 14%. If you're within a mile and you're on city water, your property value will still go up about 2.2%, but the state average is 4%. So your increase in value is half as what it would otherwise be. And that's just because you live in proximity to a well. And this is an empirical research from American Economic Review. Then we can calculate the social cost of carbon of the Shell plant. 2.2 million tons of CO2 per year over 30 years is an equivalent of $2.83 billion in costs to all of us. That's because there are more mudslides. That's because there are more heavy rain events. Or like where I lived in northern Allegheny County, softball-sized hail that destroyed the roof on the local school and stripped the leaves off of all the trees and did about $40 million in damage to homes. One event. That's social cost of carbon, and it's only going to get tougher. So if you add up these costs and subsidies, we're going to pay somewhere around $6.1 billion. Could be as high as $8.25 billion. That's what we will pay. Okay? So you hear a lot about the investment that's coming into the community, but they don't talk about what we are already paying and will pay. And that's an important number to keep in mind. And remember, we can't model everything. We didn't model the well impacts. We didn't model the impacts to your water quality. We didn't model the impact of compressor stations because we don't have the data and information to do that. This is really 3 cracker plants of what it's going to cost us. Okay, jobs, mostly out of state, temporary, and then, you see how big that site is. 400 people, 500 people running that site? It's because most of the workers aren't even here. They'll be in control rooms somewhere else in the world because of how highly automated that plant is. Okay. So here's something else. So EQT, the world's largest natural gas company, just cut its workforce by 23% in September of this year. So why is that? Because this industry has had a glut of financing, and the music's stopping now. That their costs need to be put in alignment. I'm sorry, their capital and their operations need to be aligned with what their costs are. So we're seeing these cutbacks happening on workforce. Okay, number 8. This story, despite industry trying to make it about natural gas to heat your homes or for running your furnace or cooking with, that's not what this whole thing is about. This whole thing is about making plastic because that is the only scenario where they might turn a profit. Okay? What do I mean by that? First of all, this is the spot price of natural gas in Texas this year. $0. New York Times 2 weeks ago came out with a study that says in the Permian Shale in Texas, they're just flaring the natural gas that comes up because they can't get it to market. And it's because there isn't a market big enough to absorb it all. So it's not about heating your homes. I mean, it does drive down the cost of heating your home because there's a glut of this gas, and that's a good thing. But it's not a sustainable business model. The industry is not making any money off of methane at all. In Pennsylvania, it's not quite at zero. It's about $2.70. But the industry only makes money if it's above $3.10 or so per 1,000 cubic feet. So even in Pennsylvania, we're not making money off of methane. And that's why they're rushing to build more gas-fired power plants. Because once they build enough capacity, that price will come up, and then they might be able to start making money. And guess what will happen to utility rates when that happens? They won't be cheap the way that they are now, that's for sure. So the industry's best shot is plastic. This is what will come out of the Shell plant, these little plastic pellets called nurdles. Now here's the problem with that. This is world plastic production. 40% of plastic ends up in a landfill. Sometimes within 15 minutes. Think about it. You get a package in the mail, take the plastic off, throw it in the garbage. It's on its way to the landfill. 32% of it is just lost somewhere. We don't know where it goes. But it shows up in oceans and in places around the world. 14% gets burned for generating energy, electricity. Only 14% gets captured for recycling. 4% of that is lost. 8% of that gets downcycled. So this is like making Trek board. We'll mix plastic with wood. And you can do that one time, but you can't recycle the plastic again after that. So only 2% of plastic gets captured. The rest of it ends up somewhere else. And so we are finding around the world scenarios like this. This is Henderson Island. It's the most remote island in the world, 3,500 miles from any human being. And every day, about 4,000 pieces of plastic trash wash up on the beach. Okay? Now, so, there's adaptation happening, but you can see scrapes here where this has rubbed on sand. That creates microplastic. Microplastic ends up in the ocean. It ends up in fish. It ends up in what we eat. So this is an amphipod from the Mariana Trench. It's the deepest part of the ocean. The concentration of plastic chemicals in the Mariana Trench would not pass EPA standards for exposure. And it's because once it gets down there, there's no sunlight, it's cold. It just sits there and accumulates and becomes more and more and more concentrated. This is what's happening in the world. And then, fish will eat things like this, and then they ingest it, and it makes its way up the food chain to us. Okay, this is a complicated chart. Basically what it shows is, in North America, there's a glut of polyethylene. in Asia, they're projecting a deficit of polyethylene. So what this means is this whole industry, like the Shell cracker plant, is betting on selling this plastic. Hey, Mark, how you doing? Selling this plastic overseas. The Shell plant, all the other crackers, they're planning on a near 60% increase of production by the year 2025 compared with the year 2017. Okay? U.S. can only absorb about 1.5% per year. So if you compound that over that period of time, you get around 9-10% increase in U.S. demand for plastic. That's 50, where's the other 50% go? They're banking on China taking 46% of it. Okay? And what this says is that if China doesn't take it, then it's going to displace things elsewhere in the world, or they're going to have to cut back on production. Now, there's one big problem with this, is the trade war. How much plastic is China taking? 0 in 2019. These blue are the vessels for China for liquid natural gas shipments. 0. This is liquid natural gas shipments in cubic feet to China. 0. They're not taking it. So something's not in alignment here. It's a game. It's a gamble that is being played here. So we start seeing financial reports like this. Supply glut could force some petrochemical projects to close in the mid-2020s. They're already talking about the need to close a plant like the one that they're building out here in Beaver County. Whether that would be the one that they close or not is unknown, but there was an oversupply of capacity and production. And then here's another fact. The shale industry has burned through $250 billion more than it's brought in over the last decade. So individual companies might be making money, but remember, we're financing it publicly with subsidies, right? So that allows them to draw out their timeline. But they're not making any money overall. Who's making money? Wall Street houses that set up these deals that will take an immediate cut when the deal is done. So that's an incentive for these deals. But it's not making money in the aggregate overall. So we're seeing things like bankruptcies starting to happen because of the debt levels of some of these companies. Has anyone ever heard of Rex Energy? Okay. They went bankrupt in 2018. Initially $1.2 billion in the hole. That was restructured where investors took a $600 million haircut. These sorts of things are starting to happen. Range Resources, so this is from July of this year. They needed to sell off their assets, raise $634 million because the debt level that they're carrying on their balance sheet. The clock is starting to run out on a lot of these firms that did a lot of debt financing. And Range is considered one of the better financially run drilling companies in the portfolio. And so another headline, U.S. shale is doomed no matter what they do because of the debt levels and the fact that there's no market and they have this glut of supply that doesn't match demand. It's a business model that doesn't work. And if you listen to what they have to say, they always say things like, we've drilled more last year and put more gas out there than any time in the past. Well, that's a laudable thing, but anybody can overproduce something if it's not meeting laws of supply and demand in a true business model. It's not a viable enterprise. Then we're seeing things like pipeline companies going bankrupt. Last year, the oil and gas industry was the worst performing sector on Wall Street in 2018. I need to get an updated stat for 2019. So here's a financial assessment. Oil and gas stocks are like highly speculative commodity niche investments. They lack a long-term value rationale. They're based on a weak business model, public opposition, and no longer considered a blue chip investment. That's the money that is coming into our communities. And people who tout this as the economic development model, this is what they're betting on. This is what people may not have known about for 10 years, but the truth is coming out right now. Okay, risks to life and property are high. So this is a enforcement action from the state DEP in May of this year against Energy Transfer about the fact that they eliminated 23 streams by filling them in, resulting in a loss of about 1,000 feet of stream, changed the length of 120 streams, and altered 17, eliminated 17 and altered 70 wetland areas. Okay, this is for the Revolution Pipeline, which is also this. It's also this and this, which many of you are familiar with because it's right here in your front yard. Now these companies are fighting with each other. They're trying to blame that explosion as an act of God and point the finger at one another. Oh, it wasn't us that did it. Now they're trying to blame, pawn it off on the Beaver County Conservation District, which, by the way, didn't make good decisions. They were audited earlier this year. They were giving permits for things that they shouldn't have been given. Not clear about how all the financing has been working there, and that's still an ongoing case. But this is an attempt for the state to throw local authorities under the bus, and in the midst of this finger pointing, to see who's responsible for an explosion like the Revolution Pipeline. This is what happens to communities when this industry shows up. It's that level of division, blaming, and trying to undercut one another with these sorts of secret deals and problems that occur. So a lot of you are familiar with this, the Ambridge Reservoir, running the Shell Falcon pipeline underneath the raw water line, initially making promises of a backup supply, but we find out later on maybe it's only 60% of capacity, and so on. So this is still an ongoing campaign, and people are not happy about it. 30,000 people water being put at risk. This is the Miranda Homes development in southern Allegheny County. Again, this is the Shell Falcon pipeline. There are homes here within the blast zone. These people bought these homes not even knowing that this easement was granted. Ryan Homes got about $680,000 for granting the easement, and the homeowners didn't even know. They're within the blast zone. Number 9, industry influences democracy. So this is a site that people should know about. Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania, Marcellus money. You can go on there and see that the industry's given about $11.3 million to political candidates in Pennsylvania. You can even query to see who the top recipients are. Mike Turzai, Tom Wolfe, Joe Scarnati, Scott Wagner, Rich Fitzgerald, Jay Costa. You may recognize some of these names. This is how much that they've gotten directly. You can also look at their, this is cumulatively. So Scarnati's at the top, Mike Turzai, Dave Reed, Tom Wolfe. You can look at their political action committees. So this one is the House Republican Campaign Commission, $500,000. Friends of Rich Fitzgerald, who just won an election yesterday. So this is influencing democracy. So this is a book I saw Fareed Zakaria, who's a CNN columnist, speak about 10 years ago. He talks about the inverse relationship of petrochemical money and democracy. And he concludes that there's this inverse relationship. That's not really particularly insightful. But what he mentions is the reason. The reason is the industry comes in and they say things like, we'll keep your taxes low. We'll contribute money to your local community or to your local government, and that will keep your taxes low. Maybe we'll give you money for a new public safety center. Okay? And most people are like, well, what's wrong with that? Taxes are bad, right? I don't want my taxes to go up. And it sounds like a good deal. What people forget is taxes in a democracy are the way that citizens hold their government accountable to its priorities. And so if you're not paying taxes, guess what the government does? It ignores you. Okay? And if you see contributions like that happening to candidates, who is the government paying attention to? So this is the key to the inverse relationship of democracy and petrochemical influence. Okay. So these are all people who spoke out against Donald Trump when he says he represents Pittsburgh, not Paris, in relationship to the Paris Climate Accords. And all these folks took out an ad saying, well, you know, we represent Pittsburgh. If you look at this list, there's only one politician on this list that's spoken up against the petrochemical industry. And that is Mayor William Peduto, and he did it last week. Okay, so kudos to Mayor Peduto for saying no new investment in petrochemicals. But any one of these other politicians that are making claims about addressing climate change, it's pretense. Number 10, and this is the one that hits home for me the most. We've done this before. We know this show. We know how it ends. I grew up in the Mon Valley. This is the U.S. Steel Homestead Works. At one time, it employed 18,000 people. And it all unwound like that. I grew up when the unemployment rate was 35%. The food bank wasn't even invented at that time. People didn't know where to go, so guess what? People left. And I did too. I lived away from Pittsburgh for 15 years, mostly in Virginia, because my teachers said, no opportunity in Pittsburgh in the Mon Valley, get out. It took us 30 years to clean this up, folks. A toxic legacy. People didn't even know what to do with sites like this for 10 years. And it's taken hard work to clean up the rivers, to invest in a diversified economy, to attract new investment. And yet, not everyone has been reached yet as part of that. But that's a growing thing. There's opportunity for us to build off of that and build an economic future that is a bright one that doesn't come at the expense of the environment and our health. Now, this is the Clean Jobs Pennsylvania report. 90,000 clean energy jobs already in Pennsylvania. Compare that with the 600 jobs at the Shell cracker plant, right? New York State gave a $1.5 billion tax credit to create 40,000 clean energy jobs, right? We gave a $1.6 billion tax break for 600 jobs maybe. Who's making the smarter investment in an economic future here? So I'm going to end with this. History is rife with cultures that have undermined themselves because they didn't pay attention to the environment. They didn't use it as a driver of innovation and smart decision making. So this is Easter Island. They cut down all the trees to roll the stones to make these status symbols. This is Chaco Canyon, 3 hours north of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Wonderful place to visit. It's a National Historic Site. 1 million people lived in this valley up until the year 1400. But they cut down all the trees, drained all the water. You know, these are 4-story structures that use mortar and stones and wood planks. So they deforested, they depleted the water supply, and then they abandoned these sites. So these are native peoples that live in the Four Corners region, Colorado, New Mexico, and so on. So what are we going to do? We need to adapt as well, too. So thank you for your attention tonight, and there's time for a little bit of discussion, and I look forward to hearing from all of you. If you have more questions, you can reach us at the Breathe Project. This is my email address, and please feel free to reach out. We would love to support what's happening here in Beaver County so that your voices can be heard and elevated. So I'll turn it back over now to Emily and see how she wants to take discussion from here. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
If you just want to take,
Sure.
have people raise their hands. I was over in the child's library. That's why I was late.
Oh, okay. Okay,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, you're fine. You're
Okay.
fine.
And we're filming tonight, just so you know, so if you do ask a question, know that you'll be recorded and it's going to be out on the internet.
Yeah, I have a question about the cracker plants in Ohio and West Virginia. What's the status of those, and can we expect that those will be built?
Well, so the question is, we don't really know for sure. the status here, I'm just trying to get them up here so that we can see which ones they are, these. Okay, so one thing we know is that the PTT Global one is the one that is still considered viable. They're searching for investors in order to raise the capital. Ohio is given something like close to about $200 million in public support for this site. We gave $1.6 billion. Ohio's got maybe a sixth of that right now in the game. But they're searching for investors to make this move forward. They have a site picked out. It's right across the river from Moundsville. I was just there a few weeks ago. Moundsville is an incredibly beautiful site. It's a giant burial mound that's about 80 feet high from native peoples. And you can walk up there and you can see why they put that mound there, because it's essentially at the center of a ring of mountains at the deep end of the Ohio River. And what's clear also is that it will become a bowl for pollution. That air with an inversion is just going to stay in that bowl once that plant comes up into motion. The West Virginia site near Parkersburg, the status of that officially is that it's off the table right now, but you really don't know for sure. Because there was some things with an $80 billion proposed investment from China in West Virginia for this plant. But the economic development person in West Virginia resigned because there were some questions about the numbers and how that deal was put together. So that part is not really totally certain. That's what I know about it. Others may know more, but that's what I'm aware of. Yeah, sure. Hi, yeah.
I actually have two questions. Is there a way to make this plant here less pollution or pollute less? And if not, do they have the ability to buy pollution rights from other companies to pollute us more?
Okay, so there are a couple of parts to that. The first one is, I'm not aware of any cracker plant that's built anywhere that doesn't have high emissions, because the process in and of itself, it's essentially a refinery. Okay. And so there are lots of emissions that come along with that. Now, one other thing that we have learned about Shell is they kind of adjust their performance level to the demands of the community. So if the community requires more, they're generally willing to do more. Okay. But that being said, here's what we know about the pollution credits. So when Shell wanted to build that plant, they needed to meet, because this area is out of attainment for ozone, need to buy credits to make sure that the overall amount of ozone doesn't go up in this region. Okay? There are two precursor pollutants to making ozone: VOCs and nitrogen oxides. And so there were many plants that were coal-based that have closed over the years, and those permits can live for 10 years. So they had no problem getting enough nitrogen oxide credits. In fact, I can go to their permit and we can talk very directly about these numbers. Okay, so they were able to find these nitrogen oxide 348 tons from existing sources. And it didn't cost them very much, because the people that own them, most of those farms have been closed, so they sold them, we don't know how much, but it's not very expensive. But when it came time to getting VOCs, there weren't enough of them, because this region traditionally didn't have a massive chemical industry where you see lots of VOCs. So the way that was supposed to work, because it's a market system, is they were supposed to find another business and buy those VOC credits. That means they were quite valuable, right? If you're a holder of VOC credits and someone wants to build more and they want yours, they should pay you a lot of money. But that's not what happened. They went to the state and they said, there's a glut of these NOx permits. How about converting them into VOC credits? 1-to-1 swap. And guess what the state said? Okay. And the EPA, they went to the EPA and the EPA said, okay. Now the reason for that, they claim, is that by keeping more NOx permits off the market by converting them into VOCs, that overall that can result in an overall reduction in ozone instead of allowing those NOx permits to be bought up by someone else. Now there's not really a perceived demand for these NOx permits, so it's not entirely clear that they would ever be put back into circulation anyhow. So what we have is an example of industry using government through a command and control decision to undermine a viable market so that it can satisfy its interests. It's like a currency devaluation. That's what happened here. Many of you may have been involved in the state hearings where we spoke out against this in December of 2016 to not allow them to do that. But the state, in the end, didn't give reasoning. They said in a May decision, it's within our rights to do this. And that was all the justification that they gave for that. So you talk about buying more, we would expect, there's talk about an Exxon XTO plant. We expect them to try to dip into that well again if that plant is being planned. Yeah.
Do you know if they modeled the impacts on health of the VOCs, of the increase in VOCs, or just the ozone impact?
So it's really, there is a model that they run where they check the input of VOCs and NOx. So both of these chemicals, they cook in the sun and combine with the atmosphere to make ozone, and that's what is the respiratory irritant. So they do run that, and they claim that our atmosphere in this region is called NOx limited, meaning by adding more NOx, it makes more ozone than if you add VOCs.
But I heard that they didn't measure the impact of cancer or other health impacts because of the increase in VOCs. They just looked at ozone.
Only ozone, right. Only from an ozone, because that's the way the ozone reg for the Clean Air Act works.
My understanding is there's an air monitor down the street.
Yes.
That Carnegie Mellon helped put in.
Okay.
Is it measuring the correct things to establish baseline testing? And what if once the plant gets going, it goes off the charts? What can you do? And will the public know what the results of the monitor are?
So that's a good question. So my understanding with the CREATE lab at Carnegie Mellon is that they've struggled to find locations to put the monitor. So I don't know how consistent they've been able to get baseline data. I also know folks, some of you here may be from Sewickley. There are folks in Sewickley that have installed air monitors to start doing this baseline measurement. And there are existing EPA monitors in Beaver County that measure things like particle pollution and ozone and so on. So there are some things that we could get for baseline data, but not specific signatures of specific chemicals that are VOCs. Now what I do know is part of the settlement agreement that Shell did with the community and Clean Air Council was an agreement to have an extensive monitoring system set up around this plant. One is an active monitor that will point a laser right at some of the key operating elements of the plant that can measure the specific signature of certain VOC chemicals. And that real-time monitor will have data available in 5-minute increments, and it's supposed to be available on a public website. And that data will be compared in real time with the existing monitoring network to see if the concentrations of those chemicals exceed some sort of threshold. And if they do, there's supposed to be a ring fence of every 50 yards of something called a SUMA canister, which sucks in air for processing in a lab. So if there's a change that exceeds a certain limit, these SUMA canisters are supposed to suck in that air, and within a week, people are supposed to know what was involved with that. So that's what's supposed to be set up. But what that means is we all have to figure out how to process that data. We need to figure out what that delta is. We need to figure out when Shell's going to make it available. And then what happens when certain data signatures go missing when a monitor goes offline, which we experience in the Mon Valley. When there are bad events happening, sometimes the data just mysteriously disappears. So we need to be ready to not allow that to happen and send a message to Shell right away. You get your data system up and running again. So, yeah, Mark has some more to add.
Yeah, I built out a network of purple air monitors in the Pittsburgh region, and I'm trying to collect a list of names. If there's anybody in this region who would like to host a monitor at their house, I don't know that it will be a purple air monitor, but I'm looking to find monitors that will be good for baselining, just like you asked. And so if you're interested in having a monitor at your house in this area, please find me. I'm the camera guy, and I'd be happy to add your name to a list. Yeah.
This is really good. These purple air monitors are excellent. And you can see the data in real time on a website. Yeah, there's a question up front.
So if the Shell plans basically offer busy work and it's just leeching money, why is it still all right on local government levels, state government levels, and just the government in general? Why is it still considered like fine?
Okay, so the question here was, why is the Shell plant still considered to be viable and embraced by local leadership in Beaver County? So if you think about it, the state gave a $1 billion tax break, right? Think about what you can do with $1 billion. You can do a lot with $1 billion. And Shell also is self-financing this plant. So they're leveraging that, and they are spending money in this community. And if you're a local official and someone's spending money in creating economic activity, particularly if you're in a community that hasn't had a lot of investment in the past, it sounds like a pretty good deal. Now, what I contend is that people here generally haven't started paying for it yet. People will start paying for that Shell plant when it's turned on. That's when you all will start paying. Right now, it's all investment, workers, hotels, coffee shops, and that's not a bad thing, right? I mean, you have to say that's not a bad thing. But there's a tail end that comes with this. And that's where the caution needs to be sounded right now. And so if you're a local official, I would ask them, what is your plan 5 years from now when, for example, there's an upset event at this plant and a cloud comes right over Beaver and all these tables that are set outside right on your business district for people who like to eat lunch outside no longer want to do that anymore. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah, back to you.
I apologize, I got a bunch of questions. You said you showed a slide, there was 12,000 some wells and 13,000 violations. Are the fines high enough to offset and make the industry do the right thing? Yeah, that's a number. Are the fines high enough that this, if you have 12,000...
I'm just going to say no. But there's more to this story. So there have been investigative journalism that found, for example, a lot of the fines and paperwork for them had disappeared in some closets in some DEP sites. That enforcement in the past wasn't necessarily even being done. So this is what we know about. There's more to the story. But these companies, they have access to capital now. So they move fast. They don't care what happens. They need to get the drill in the ground and the stuff pumped out as quickly as possible. And that's what's tricky. Now, it's not to say that every operator does a bad job. It's just that it's an inherently complex industry, and sometimes if cement doesn't set right in an annular a plug that's being built around a well, leakage will happen. Or there may be a truck that spills something. So, it's inherently a complex enterprise that results in these problems. But the DEP is understaffed. Its budget and its staff has been cut 40% since the year 2008 at exactly the wrong time. So it's a system that's under stress overall. And these fines are not really a deterrent for stopping these problems. Yes.
Well, I'm wondering, in light of the fact that the agencies charged with protecting us are not doing that, either because they're on the take from industry or understaffed or for whatever reason. What are the other political alternatives? I know we have a state, we have a right in Pennsylvania to clean air and clean water. Has that ever been used in the courts to force companies to do something more reasonable than what they're doing? Or are there other laws that have been used to sue the agencies that are supposed to enforce the laws, enforce them?
So there's a lot to what you're saying. The answer, there are a couple of layers to an answer. From a deterrent perspective, there has been significant legal action. There's a decision called the Gorseline case that occurred in the Robinson case that occurred last year, I think, or was it 2017? I can't remember. But anyhow, what it did was reestablish the rights for a local municipal government to zone for oil and natural gas and be able to say where it can take place. Act 13, which was passed on Valentine's Day in 2011, took that right away from municipal government. And so a lot of these problems crept up because of the attempt to circumvent that legal restriction. So that decision by the state Supreme Court really has put some backstop. If you can't prevent it totally, you can at least restrict where it can happen, and there's a lot of power in doing that. Second thing, there's currently a case before the state Supreme Court that's addressing something called the law of capture. And this is a big deal. The law of capture goes back to English law. It started with fox hunting. And let's say, I'm a property owner here and you're a property owner here, and I'm hunting foxes, and the foxes run off my property over to your property and you shoot them. And you say, well, they're mine because they're on my property. And I say, no, they're not. They're mine because they started on my property. Well, the law of capture says if they run onto someone else's property, it's theirs. And that's what works for oil and natural gas. This principle was established in the 19th century, that if you stick a well in the ground and start sucking up oil or natural gas, even if it comes from a neighboring property, because of the law of capture and it's flowing to your well, you get it. Well, what's different about now with fracking is that you can stick the straw in the ground, but it doesn't flow. It's locked up in shale. So if you drill and put charges in there, perf gun, with massive amounts of water to crack the rock under someone else's property, and now it starts to flow, are you stealing their resource? And that's what a superior court ruling, an appeals court in Pennsylvania said, actually you're stealing their resource. So this could be a major wrench in the entire industry's business model. And we're expecting a decision on this relatively soon. There were arguments that were done on this year. So there are lots of these legal challenges that are happening out there that give us some hope. Bob has a question. Then I'll come back to you in the back. Yeah.
Yeah, in August 12th in Chemical and Engineering News, the senior editor, Rick Mullen, came from New York City down here to Beaver County in West Virginia and was looking at outside eyes looking here at the cracker plant. And he wrote a pretty good article called Community Outreach 35 Years After Bhopal. Now, a lot of people don't realize, they're too young to hear about Bhopal, India, where Union Carbide had an explosion and killed thousands of people. Rick was looking at what protections does the chemical industry have today that's changed, that's actually upgraded to where the people living around these plants can actually have an alarm and have some kind of evacuation plan to protect them. And we found here within the last few months in Beaver County, we're grossly underprotected because of the fire that happened down in Rochester. And those chemicals went throughout the valley, you know, and hardly anybody was notified. So, you know, we're looking at a parallel that the chemical industry has failed and government has failed the general public in our protection. And, you know, they swore an oath to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the community, and I think they've failed us.
Yeah, I mean, that speaks directly to this point, number 9. Number 9, right there. Right. So we need a response. I mean, that's part of the organizing here. One is to push back, but the other piece is people come together so that you insist that you have protections. That's something that we need to have both paths underway right now, so that you can request and demand protection at the same time trying to push back on the industry as a whole. There was a question all the way in the back. Yeah.
So you talked about Bill Peduto speaking out and saying we don't want another plant because, as you know, ExxonMobil is now talking about building another plant.
Right.
And you mentioned vote, but who do we vote for? Because the commissioners that were in the article in the Beaver County Times said, we want more industry here. Bill Peduto does not speak for Beaver County. What do we do?
Right. So that speaks to, you know, I hope that everyone that's in this room, that some of you will consider running for office. That part of the weakness and what allows this to happen is we've essentially in this country lived for 50 years where we're willing to delegate things to other people. So for our health, we delegate it to hospitals and doctors. For learning, we delegate it to teachers. For building things, we delegate it to engineers. And for governance, we delegate it to that cadre of people that likes to be politicians. And, you know, there's a certain amount of additional free time that we get by doing that. But those times have come at a price, and the price is we don't have a pool of candidates who are willing to say, you know what, I'm going to make changes in my life to invest the time to stand up for issues that I know more people care about. So we need to build that movement. Everyone here, I would consider saying, step up, try to get involved. You might not think you can do it, but you can. There are candidates that have won. I look at Sarah Innamorato, I look at Summer Lee. These are candidates in Allegheny County that are state reps now that ran on air quality campaign-related issues and won. So we need more people. That's basically what it comes down to. We're a little behind the game here, but it can always be stopped.
I just want to add to that. I work with Matt and in communications for the Breathe Project. And in the meantime, while you're making that happen, you can push back against these county commissioners.
Yes.
Write them a letter, call them up, tell them you don't want this industry here.
Yes.
That's ridiculous. You read about it in the Beaver County Times. They need to hear from everybody in this room that this shouldn't be happening here.
That's exactly right. All of your voices matter. Everyone here can write a letter, make an appointment with your state rep, and say, I want to spend 15 minutes talking to you about my concerns. They will hear from all of us, and that will change things around. You were going to comment.
So along those lines, I'm Andrew, I'm with the Clean Air Council. We also support Matt's
Nice to meet you.
So the clipboard that was going around, can we put that in the air real quick, by the way? Terry has it, great. So the clipboard that was going around is for the Clean Air Council. And part of my job is to help introduce you guys, if you want it, to a pretty easy curriculum once a month that you can get together with your neighbors and learn about the history of these issues, the current current things going on, and then help figure out with you what you want to do about it. That's actually my job. So voting is great, right? Connecting with Sarah and Summer Lee and the Unite PAC is a great way to help get support towards candidates who are maybe bottom up candidates, right? but on the ground organizing is where things actually happen, and that's a skill in and of itself, right? Matt is great with data and numbers, and that's why I stopped at undergrad and started organizing, right? Because that is my skill. So if your name is on that page, right, you will be getting an email, probably from me or Terry, about how to maybe like get involved. If that's something you want to talk about more in depth before you leave, you can find me. I'm happy to answer questions and point you in some kind of direction. There's also lots of groups in here, like representatives from BCMAC and Reimagine Beaver and Beaver County United. Like, there's lots of groups to get involved with, and I would recommend finding them. The other thing, just to a point that Matt made earlier, is that, you know, the big selling point, right, is the jobs and all these other things, which are good, right? Like, I've talked to those workers. I was actually, before this job, gonna join the Carpenters Union. I was like filing out the application process. These are great jobs in terms of pay and benefits and long-term security in some ways. What it's not great for is the fact that there is a zinc smelter on that site, and every time they walk through the dirt, right, they got lead on their boots. And Shell will tell you that they remediated the soil properly, and that's what the paperwork said. But if you know someone who works at that plant, right, if you know a neighbor that works at that plant, they may have exposure to lead. And that's something that we need to figure out. Because if that's the case, right, if they have been exposed to lead, that means that Shell didn't remediate the soil properly, right? Or it means that our regulations aren't sufficient for actually keeping us safe. Is that something that you guys want to know about?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if those are things you know, that you want to get involved with or move to, there's people in the room who can help you get organized, and that's something that I'm here to do. So.
And with that, I just want to give a shout out to our friends at BCMAC who've been relentlessly battling this issue for years. Thank you for all of you who've been dedicated. And for people who are new to this, get to know these folks at BCMAC and get involved. These folks need your support. Go ahead, Thaddeus. Yeah.
I currently live in Franklin Park in Allegheny County, and I want to report to you how grassroots organizations can work. We got terribly upset when Penn Energy Resources, who has wellheads in Economy Borough, Beaver County, was looking to lease one of our parks. And I said, not when I'm alive. That's how I felt about it. I went to borough meetings 3 times a month. I spent my life there. They got to know me, I got to know them, and I got a handful of other people involved. Guess what? Our Protect Franklin Park people decided they're going to run for office on council. They've never, all Republican council, never had an opponent. 3 out of 4 Dems won yesterday. And the fourth almost won. Came very close. So now we have Democratic representation on our council. Never had an opponent. Can you believe that? And it's according to the state, it's the best municipality to live in Pennsylvania. So
Except for Beaver.
But here's what we went. We testified every month. We were there saying something. They got tired of seeing me. Okay? And then we came up with the idea, instead of Franklin Park, we think it's going to be called Fracking Park. That got to them. We got into talking about property values. That gets anybody's attention, no matter what your stripes are. And guess what? The zoning overlay, they had to find an industrial zone somewhere over an R1 residential area. We didn't like that. We pushed back. It's right next to where I live. Think I'm upset? You bet I am. Okay. So we did something. We did something. We got the media to be with us. We had Food and Water Watch help us. It was stunning. So from a grassroots effort, we have 3 Dems on council. We had the existing council write a letter to Mike Turzai, Lisa Williams, and the governor saying you should change the rules on how this happens in our communities. Cool, huh?
Yeah. So there are people like Thaddeus who can help. There's a lot of knowledge that can be shared here. Okay, we've got time for one more question. So right here, yeah.
A few years ago, I was on a plane to Dallas, full of cowboy businessmen, and I engaged them, and I go, what brings you to here? They said, oh, we're looking at the fracking, and I'm going to swear, I hope you don't mind, they said to me in quotes, you got shit up there. So I want to ask you, what were they talking about? They wouldn't invest here.
So I'll speculate. The gas that comes out of the ground here is 40% wet gas. Okay. At first, that was thought to be a negative because people wanted methane, and they thought that's what it was about. Then they figured out you can't make money off methane, but plastics you sure can, and that's why the Shell plant is here. So that's the shit that we have here. Maybe we'll take one more. Yeah, just one more. Last word. I don't know if I have an exact answer for that. I think commissioning is supposed to start in late 2020 and early 2021.
You have, I was talking to Joe, he's spokesman for them, just 2 days ago. And he said in the early 2020s.
Early 2020.
Yeah, early 2020.
Oh, early 2020.
I said, so that could be 2020 to 2025, and he said yes. Incidentally, he has been promoted and is moving to Houston. Just
if you consider that a promotion. Okay. Thanks for that info. Yeah, okay. All right, well, thank you all for coming. The energy that you have, build off of it. Let's work together. Thank you all very much. Good luck.